There's a certain kind of silence that only exists after midnight in rural places. It's not ordinary quiet. It's not peace. I mean the kind of silence where your brain starts searching for signals because it can't accept the absence of them. The refrigerator hum disappears. The highway noise fades out. The neighbors are asleep. Even the dogs stop barking. And suddenly you become aware that you're standing on a spinning rock, suspended in a black ocean so enormous that your entire species has only managed to crawl a few inches into it. And on some nights, if you stare upward long enough, you begin to understand why people see things. Not because they're stupid, not because they're crazy, because the sky itself feels aware of being watched. Now, I know that sounds dramatic. Maybe it is. But I don't think people talk honestly enough about how emotionally strange the night sky really is. During the daytime, the universe feels manageable. Bills exist. Grocery stores exist. Traffic lights exist. Daylight tricks the nervous system into believing civilization is the natural state of reality. But at 2 a.m, standing outside alone under the stars, older than human memory, all of that starts feeling temporary, fragile, like a thin crust over something vast and ancient. And tonight I want to talk about that thing that has lived in that darkness for generations. Not just aliens, not just UFOs, something stranger than that. The possibility that humanity has been trying to emotionally prepare itself for contact long before contact ever officially arrived. In a world full of noise, trust the signal. If you're hearing this, you've already found it. This is Dove and Serpent Radio. You know what fascinates me most about the modern UAP conversation? It's not the footage, it's not the congressional hearings, it's not the military pilots describing impossible maneuvers, it's not even the classified documents. It's the emotional tone people use when they talk about it. Because when people discuss possible extraterrestrial intelligence, they almost never sound excited for very long. There's always this subtle shift that happens after the first few minutes. Curiosity turns into discomfort. The conversation starts playful and then slowly drifts somewhere colder. People laugh, then pause, then lower their voices without realizing they're doing it. And I think that matters. Human beings have imagined monsters forever, right? Dragons, demons, spirits in the woods, ancient gods living in storms. Well, those fears were local. They existed within the geography of Earth. Aliens are different. Aliens imply intelligence without human context, minds without shared biology. Technology so advanced, it might appear supernatural. Motivation, we may not even possess the mental architecture to understand. That's the part movies never capture correctly, right? The real fear wouldn't be invasion. It would be incomprehension. Imagine an octopus trying to understand Wi-Fi. Well, that might actually be closer to our position than people want to admit. And the older I get, the more I suspect that the deepest terror surrounding UAP phenomena isn't physical danger. It's philosophical displacement. The fear that humanity may not occupy the center of reality anymore. Maybe we never did. There's this strange recurring detail in a lot of close encounter reports that almost nobody talks about because it sounds too mundane, to be meaningful. Witnesses will describe seeing something impossible in the sky, and afterward they become obsessed with ordinary things. Water running from faucets, birds gathering on power lines, right? Street lights flickering, clock radios, the sound of fluorescent lights. And that fascinates me because trauma doesn't always announce itself through screaming terror. Sometimes trauma appears as hyper-awareness. The nervous system suddenly realizing the world is stranger than it previously believed. And once that door opens, even slightly, ordinary reality starts looking staged somehow. I remember reading about a man years ago who claimed he saw an object hovering over a frozen field behind a gas station in Nebraska, sometime in like the 90s. No dramatic abduction story, no little gray men. He just described standing there, smoking a cigarette, while this enormous, silent thing remained motionless above the field for maybe 40 seconds, before accelerating upward, faster than his eyes could follow. What stayed with me wasn't the sighting itself. It's what he said afterward. He said that for the next 6 months, every airplane felt wrong to him. Commercial jets, crop dusters, helicopters. He knew intellectually what they were, right? But emotionally, something had shifted. He'd look up and think, that thing is pretending to be normal. And that sentence bothered me for years. Pretending to be normal. Because once the possibility enters your mind that something genuinely unknown may already occupy our skies, every familiar object becomes contaminated by uncertainty. The boundary between known and unknown weakens. And humans are creatures that depend psychologically on stable categories. Bird, plane, right? Star, satellite, cloud. Once those categories fail, even once, your nervous system begins scanning continuously for further anomalies. I think that's why some people become consumed by the phenomenon after a single encounter. It's not obsession in the ordinary sense, it's cognitive injury. The brain trying desperately to rebuild a reliable model of reality. You're listening to Dove and Serpent Radio. Now, there's another angle to this that I can't stop thinking about lately, and maybe it's because, technology itself has started becoming uncanny in ways, previous generations never experienced. Now, think about this carefully, okay? For most of human history, mysterious lights in the sky were interpreted spiritually because no technological framework existed. Then the industrial age arrived, and suddenly mysterious objects became mechanical, metallic, right? Engineered. We updated the mythology according to our tools. But now, we're entering another phase entirely. Artificial intelligence, autonomous drones, deep fake reality, quantum computing, machine-generated voices, right? Algorithmic behavioral prediction. Technology itself is beginning to behave like folklore. That's new. People used to fear like a haunted forest. Now people fear recommendation systems. And, honestly, I understand why. A few nights ago, I fell into one of those, accidental late night internet spirals, right? You know the kind. You look up one thing and suddenly 3 hours disappear. I ended up reading accounts from air traffic controllers discussing these near misses with objects that showed no transponder signatures. Some of the reports were probably explainable, yeah. Some were likely exaggerated. But a few carried this unsettling, bureaucratic realism that made them difficult to dismiss. One controller described an object pacing a commercial aircraft at high altitude before abruptly changing direction at impossible speed. Another described radar returns appearing and disappearing over restricted airspace for weeks at a time. Not dramatic storytelling, not sensational language, just tired professionals documenting events they couldn't categorize. Maybe that's what really unsettles me the most about these modern UAP discussions. Not the weirdness, the professionalism. When military personnel sound confused, right, it changes the emotional temperature entirely. Because we unconsciously assume that someone, somewhere, understands what's happening. The governments, scientists, pilots, somebody, right? Civilization depends, psychologically, on the belief that competent adults are managing reality behind the scenes, yeah? But what if they aren't? What if they're standing under the same sky we are, equally uncertain? That possibility changes something fundamental in the human emotional landscape. I think about that sometimes, when I see those clips of the fighter pilots reacting in real time to the unidentified objects. The fear in their voices isn't movie fear, stranger than that. It's cognitive shock. You can hear trained perception failing in real time. Look at that thing. What is that? It's moving against the wind. You can hear the certainty collapsing. There's something deeply human about that collapse. Because despite all of our systems and satellites and universities and equations, we remain biological creatures staring upward into mystery. And there's another detail people rarely discuss openly. A lot of serious UAP witnesses describe an emotional atmosphere around encounters that sounds almost dreamlike. Not hallucination exactly. More like reality becoming slightly softened around the edges. Sound feels distant. Time maybe feels strange. Thoughts become unusually vivid. Now, there are obviously psychological explanations for a lot of this, right? Stress affects your perception. Fear affects memory encoding. The brain does strange things under uncertainty, but still, the consistency of those descriptions is interesting. Especially because altered states of consciousness have historically accompanied encounters with the unknown across almost every culture on Earth. Shamans, mystics, desert prophets, vision quests, sleep paralysis, religious apparitions, alien encounters. Different language, same underlying emotional architecture. An intrusion from outside ordinary consensus reality. And before anybody gets nervous, no, I'm not saying aliens are demons or angels or interdimensional spirit beings or whatever tonight's internet theory happens to be. I'm not saying that. Honestly, I think people rush too quickly toward conclusions because uncertainty is psychologically painful. But I do think something important happens. When human beings encounter phenomena they cannot contextualize. The boundary of the self temporarily weakens. And once that happens, reality becomes emotionally permeable in a way that's difficult to explain afterward. And you know what's eerie? Almost every generation believes that it lives at the edge of revelation. Ancient civilizations watched eclipses and believed the gods were speaking. Medieval astronomers believed comets predicted catastrophe. The 20th century watched these atomic explosions and believed humanity had crossed into forbidden territory. And now, here we are. Artificial intelligence emerging simultaneously with increasing UAP disclosure. Quantum physics undermining classical intuition. Private corporations launching rockets into orbit while military footage of impossible aerial objects circulates online. Honestly, if you describe the current decade to anybody from 1950, they'd probably assume civilization was approaching either transcendence or collapse. Maybe both. There's this feeling lately, right? Maybe you felt it too, that reality itself has become informationally unstable. Too many narratives, too many signals, too many contradictory truths existing simultaneously. And in that environment, the UAP phenomenon thrives. Not necessarily because the phenomenon itself is increased, but because humanity's psychological defenses against uncertainty are weakening. People are ready to believe something strange is happening because ordinary reality already feels strange. I was driving home one night last winter. Roads completely empty. Snowbanks glowing under streetlights. The whole town looked abandoned, right? And at one point, I stopped at a red light with absolutely nobody around. No cars, no pedestrians, nothing. Just me. I had this overwhelming thought that civilization itself might just be a temporary flare of consciousness in an otherwise silent universe. Like a campfire lit in an endless wilderness. And that thought hit me, like physically, because we spend most of our lives surrounded by human systems that make existence feel crowded and familiar, right? Notifications, traffic, buildings, schedules, but occasionally you get a glimpse of how thin all of it really is. Beyond our atmosphere, silence. And maybe that's why the idea of extraterrestrial intelligence affects people so deeply. Not because we fear being alone anymore, because we fear we never were. You're listening to Dove and Serpent Radio. Do you know one of the strangest patterns in UFO folklore across decades? The entities themselves keep changing, In the 50s, encounters often involved clean-cut humanoids in these silver suits, right? Very Cold War imagery. And then in the 80s, gray aliens dominated the reports. Clinical, emotionless, technological. More recently, encounters have become more vague, less physical, more abstract, That alone should make people think carefully. Because whether the phenomenon is objectively real, psychologically projected, culturally shaped, or some combination we don't yet understand, it appears to interact with human expectation in fascinating ways, almost like a mirror. Carl Jung once suggested that UFOs functioned psychologically as modern myths, symbols emerging from collective uncertainty during periods of technological and existential upheaval. And honestly, even if that were 100% true, it would not make the phenomenon any less interesting. Hey, it might make it more important. Because myths are not meaningless. Myths are emotional maps. And perhaps the modern alien narrative reveals something profound about humanity's current psychological condition. We suspect intelligence greater than our own exists somewhere beyond our systems. We fear surveillance, we fear manipulation, we fear experimentation, we fear becoming obsolete. Sound familiar? Half of modern life already feels like contact with incomprehensible intelligence. Algorithms determine what billions of people see each day. Machine learning systems shape behavior invisibly. Digital platforms predict desires before users can even consciously articulate them. And maybe that's partly why alien imagery resonates so strongly now. We already live under these invisible systems that we barely understand. Sometimes I wonder if, future historians will look back at the alien obsession of the 20th and 21st centuries and interpret it a little bit less literally than we do now. Maybe they'll say humanity sensed its own transformation approaching and translated that anxiety into cosmic imagery. Or maybe actual non-human intelligence is genuinely here. And honestly, I don't know. And I think pretending certainty in either direction is intellectually dishonest. But uncertainty itself can become spiritually interesting if you sit with it long enough. That's the thing people misunderstand about mystery. Mystery isn't merely ignorance waiting for explanation, Genuine mystery changes consciousness. It alters the emotional texture of existence. A universe containing possible unknown intelligences feels fundamentally different from a dead mechanical universe. It's more alive, more dangerous, more meaningful, and more unstable. There's an old story I heard years ago from this retired park ranger out in Arizona. Could be nonsense, but I guess it could be true. It doesn't really matter because the emotional core stayed with me. He claimed that during overnight patrols in remote desert areas, people occasionally reported lights moving silently over canyon ridges with this impossible smoothness. No engine noise, no blinking navigation lights, just pale objects drifting silently through darkness. But the strange part wasn't the lights. He said animals reacted first. Horses became agitated before the sightings. Coyotes disappeared from entire areas. Birds stopped vocalizing. Again, maybe coincidence. But, human beings have always trusted animal perception around danger because animals notice environmental shifts before we do. Storms, earthquakes, predators. Imagine for a moment there truly were technologies operating around us beyond current human comprehension. What subtle effects might biological systems detect before conscious human awareness catches up? Maybe none. Or maybe intuition itself evolved partly as a survival response to patterns that consciousness can't fully articulate. And that idea fascinates me. Not psychic powers, not supernatural things, just the possibility that human beings absorb more environmental information subconsciously than we consciously recognize. Have you ever had the feeling of somebody watching you before turning around and confirming it? Yeah, most people have. Science debates the mechanism, coincidence, peripheral cues, evolutionary threat detection. But the sensation itself is universal. Now, scale that feeling upward. What would it feel like if humanity itself were being observed? Not invaded, observed. I think deep down, that's the emotional center of many alien narratives. The sense of being studied by something outside our frame of reference. And honestly, human beings already do this constantly to other, species. We tranquilize animals, we tag whales, we track migration patterns, we observe primate behavior, we monitor ecosystems from orbit. From the animal's perspective, our behavior must seem incomprehensible, terrifying sometimes, benevolent at other times, impossible to contextualize fully. And that comparison humbles me, because humans always imagine contact from the position of importance. We imagine negotiations, communication, and even, diplomacy. But intelligence, vastly beyond ours, may not perceive us as peers at all. That's not supposed to be pessimism. It's just scale. The universe operates on scales human psychology struggles to emotionally process. Deep time alone is almost impossible for the nervous system to fully grasp. Dinosaurs feel ancient to us, right? Yet the universe existed for billions of years before the earth was even formed. Billions. And somewhere inside that incomprehensible span, consciousness emerged at least once. And that alone should already feel miraculous enough to keep us awake at night. Sometimes I think the real reason alien stories endure, right, generation after generation, is because they externalize humanity's oldest spiritual question. Are we alone in existence? Not socially, cosmically. And maybe every civilization eventually asks that question once it becomes, technologically advanced enough to recognize the size of the universe that surrounds it. Maybe this entire phase of human history is psychologically inevitable. A species looks upward long enough and eventually begins imagining eyes looking back. And you know what else I find interesting? People often assume proof of extraterrestrial intelligence would unite humanity. I'm not so convinced. Honestly, I think it might fracture us psychologically before it united us. Because human beings interpret uncertainty through existing belief structures, religion, politics, national identity, fear, hope. Some people would view contact spiritually, some militarily, others commercially, some apocalyptically, some even, romantically. And corporations would probably try to monetize it within 48 hours. Can you imagine that? First confirmed extraterrestrial signal detected, and immediately there's merch. Limited edition alien burger combo. Human beings are unbelievable. And honestly, I love that about us. That weird combination of terror and absurdity feels deeply human. I think about this whenever people speak about disclosure, as though it would arrive cleanly. One press conference, one announcement, one undeniable revelation. Reality doesn't work that way anymore. Modern civilization exists inside these overlapping, layers of informational chaos. Even genuine evidence now competes against misinformation, irony, conspiracy culture, satire, algorithmic distortion. Which means something historically unprecedented could theoretically occur, and half of us might scroll right past it to watch some cooking videos. And even that possibility is just surreal in its own way. The end of humanity's cosmic isolation arriving between advertisements and cell phone notifications. And maybe that's why the phenomenon increasingly feels emotionally diffuse rather than dramatic. Like a low, persistent hum beneath culture instead of a singular, shocking event. A strange object here, military report over there, leaked video down there, a scientist speaking carefully, a politician hinting vaguely. The atmosphere accumulates gradually like humidity before a storm. You're tuned to Dove and Serpent Radio. There's one aspect of the alien question that affects me more personally than the rest. And I don't hear people discuss it often because maybe it sounds too sentimental. If intelligent life exists elsewhere, then suffering exists elsewhere too. Think about that. Somewhere in the universe, other conscious beings may have experienced grief, loneliness, curiosity, loss, wonder, fear of death, love for their children, nostalgia for vanished places. Maybe entirely different biology, different senses, different minds. But consciousness itself may still produce emotional gravity. And for some reason, that thought makes the universe feel a little less empty to me. Not safer, no, just less empty. There's a photograph that astronauts sometimes talk about. It's called the pale blue dot. And it's Earth, appearing as a tiny suspended speck in vast darkness. Carl Sagan famously reflected on human arrogance while discussing it. But whenever I see that image, I think about vulnerability instead. Every human exists on that little dot. Every poem, every war, every sleeping child, every heartbreak, every song ever written, every late-night radio station, and beyond it, unknown distance. The emotional scale of that realization is kind of difficult to carry for very long. And that's probably why people return so quickly to ordinary life afterward. Grocery list, email, laundry. Human beings survive psychologically by narrowing focus. But occasionally, at night, the larger reality leaks back in. And hey, maybe that's healthy. Maybe awe itself is psychologically necessary. Maybe civilizations become spiritually sick when they lose contact entirely with mystery. Not superstition, mystery. And there is a difference. Mystery is intellectual humility before existence. And honestly, I think the modern world desperately needs more of that humility. Because despite our technologies, we still understand remarkably little about consciousness, reality, time, dark matter, quantum behavior, even our own oceans. Human knowledge is, extraordinary compared to previous eras. But against the scale of existence, we remain children drawing maps beside an endless ocean. Well, that doesn't diminish humanity. If anything, it makes our curiosity more beautiful. Sometimes I imagine these future archaeologists from another civilization uncovering the remnants of Earth, right? Like long after we're gone. Imagine them piecing together fragments of human broadcasts, music recordings, television commercials, distorted radio transmissions. What conclusions would they draw about us? Would they recognize loneliness in our art? Would they understand humor? Would they notice how often humans created stories about visitors from the sky? Maybe every intelligent species eventually imagines being contacted because consciousness itself produces longing for connection beyond the self. Or maybe those stories begin after contact has already occurred in subtle ways, impossible to fully articulate. See, that's the dangerous beauty of the phenomenon. It permanently destabilizes certainty. Every interpretation opens additional questions. And maybe that's why people become emotionally addicted to the mystery itself. Not because they necessarily want answers, but because mystery restores depth to existence. A fully explained universe might actually feel emotionally unbearable. There's kind of an odd comfort in knowing that some doors remain unopened. Still, sometimes late at night I wonder what would happen if undeniable proof finally arrived. Not blurry footage, not rumors, not speculation. Real proof. A signal, a landing, a transmission. Something impossible to reinterpret. I honestly don't know how humanity would emotionally metabolize that revelation. Because I suspect the first feeling wouldn't be excitement. I think it would be silence. Global silence. The kind of silence that happens when an entire species suddenly realizes the universe has been larger than its imagination all along. And maybe somewhere, something else has already experienced that exact moment too. Maybe entire civilizations throughout cosmic history have stood beneath unfamiliar stars, realizing they were no longer alone. That thought is strangely beautiful to me. A chain of awakenings stretching across galaxies. Consciousness discovering consciousness. Or searching endlessly for it. Maybe both. There's something that is deeply haunting about radio itself when you think about it. Human voices transformed into these invisible waves traveling through darkness, broadcast into empty space. Technically, fragments of old Earth transmissions continue moving outward through the cosmos, always, right now. Ancient television signals, emergency broadcasts, music, static. Somewhere, light years away, the ghost of humanity is still traveling. And I love that image. Old late-night radio shows drifting endlessly through interstellar darkness long after the hosts themselves are gone. And maybe that's what we are in the end. Signals searching for listeners. And maybe intelligence elsewhere is doing the same thing. Sending transmissions into the silence, hoping something answers back. Until next time, stay strange in the silence. Keep the dial somewhere between wonder and understanding.